Is it true that some DNA for Native Americans really came from the Middle East? Can that be proven? The answer is yes, and in this video I'll give you the proof. We'll look at a DNA type that's passed down the mother's line, and it's called Mitochondrial DNA Haplogroup X, which is found in some Native Americans and can be shown to come from the Middle East. In testing DNA, the first type of DNA testing that they did was of the mitochondrial DNA. Now, this is inherited from the mother, and so it's passed down through the maternal line. And in doing DNA testing, you can determine the maternal ancestry along the maternal line. When they did that for Native Americans, what they found was that the majority of Native Americans have a mitochondrial DNA type that is East Asian mitochondrial DNA types, known as mitochondrial DNA types A, B, C, and D. But there was also another DNA type that was discovered, and this was called mitochondrial DNA Haplogroup X. Now, this DNA type did not appear to come from Eastern Asia. So the first initial reaction was that, well, maybe this isn't really an ancestral type, because the mainstream understanding, as you know, has been that Native Americans, their ancestors came via migration across the Bering Strait. So when they found this DNA ancestry for Native Americans that didn't look East Asian, what they found is that in fact looked Middle Eastern in origin. However, since that time, it's clearly been proven to be an ancient Native American DNA type that was in the Americas during the Book of Mormon timeframes. We know this because it has been found in some ancient Native American skeletons, including ancient Native American skeletons that were buried in Hopewell mound builder burial mounds that have been carbon dated to Book of Mormon timeframes. So at this point, there's really no dispute anymore, and there's not really anybody that will contest or say that haplogroup X is not an authentic Native American ancestry source, a Native American DNA type. And instead, the question is turned to, well, is it really from the Middle East? Was it really here during Book of Mormon timeframes, or was it sooner? And so in addressing whether it's really from the Middle East, what I'm going to do is I'm going to share some text and sites that are in my book, Face of a Nephite. One of the first things that you can look at is, where is the highest concentration outside of North America? So in other words, for Native Americans, they had to have come from somewhere in the Old World. You can look at that for mitochondrial DNA haplogroup X. And what you find is that the highest concentrations in the world for this DNA type are for indigenous groups, the highest concentrations are among Native Americans, particularly in the Northeast North America, the Algonquin type tribes. But then also in the Old World, the highest locations are in the Mediterranean area, particularly in the Middle East. And now there are other maps showing concentration that kind of break it out in greater detail in terms of looking at where are the highest concentrations of this DNA type in the whole world, in the Old World, talking about haplogroup X overall, and it's from the Middle East. So that's the first indicator pointing to the Middle East as the likely source for haplogroup X. Now, there is a second thing that we can look at too, and that is, where is the nearest relative for the Native Americans? Now, for haplogroup X, Native Americans mostly have a branch called haplogroup X X2A. There are a few that have another DNA type called X2G. So they're actually, Native Americans have two branches of haplogroup X. Now, when you look into the Old World and you look, where is the closest relative of haplogroup X2A, the nearest relatives have been found in Iran and Egypt. that nearest relative in the Middle East, it's actually genetically closer to the Native Americans with X2A. And it turns out that Native Americans with X2A are from Native Americans with X2G. So I put a little diagram here. So the red indicates a Native American X2A DNA type and the X2G DNA type. And what this shows is that the closest DNA type to X2A in the world is actually X2J, which is in Iran and Egypt. And that in terms of ancestry, the closest ancestor is also in the Middle East and the Mediterranean, X2. There might be some, they'll say, oh no, X came from the Altai region in Siberia. But that's not actually correct. In studying this, experts have confirmed that the closer relatives are in the Middle East. Relatives that are more distant, that are in the Altai region and Siberia, are not plausible ancestors for the Native Americans. That's older or less informed studies that has been superseded by closer study. This closest X2J DNA type was in an oasis here in Egypt. Now there will be some that will say, but those aren't immediate ancestors of the Native Americans. That is true. The immediate ancestor has not been found yet in the Old World. But that doesn't mean that they're not from the Middle East. The fact that the immediate ancestor hasn't been found means that there's a gap in the knowledge, but the closest relative and the closest ancestors are from the Middle East. So that is the most likely source. There's one last thing you can look at in terms of the origin of the DNA type, and that is to look for the location with the greatest diversity of the DNA type. And what that means is that it's been there, it has the most mutations, and it kind of reflects that it's been there the longest with the most time for mutations and branches to spread out. So when you look in the Old World for the location that has the greatest diversity of haplogroup X, that is also the Near East. So all three ways of looking at where the ancestry came from, the concentration, the nearest relatives, the diversity, all of those point to the Near East, also called the Middle East, as the geographic origin for the DNA type. And I put up here citations from the peer-reviewed literature just to show that this is done by peer-reviewed non-Mormon scientists.